Hey, Roddy, Luke McElroy from Mets Performance Consultant. 3, 2, 1. Hey, everybody, Luke McElroy from Mets Performance Consulting. Welcome back to another episode of the Physiology Secrets podcast. Joined again with Nick Jane Koskis. And today we're going to talk about carb periodization. Apologies for the stuffed up intro. This is our third podcast on the fly, and I've said it too many times. So we had a question come through in relation to a podcast we released the other week about fasted training for athletes. And it came from Caleb Noonan, who is a young gun triathlete. Keep an eye out for him on the pro circuit in a couple of years. And he just asked, what is our opinion on fueling for the work required as opposed to, keto diets versus carbohydrate loading and all the rest? Just purely, what is our opinion on fueling for the work required? So it sparked a bit of a discussion between Nick and myself about carb periodization. Nick, do you just want to give us a quick overview of what carb periodization is, and then we'll sort of break that down into a bit more detail?
Yeah, so pretty much carb periodization is like you would do any sort of periodization with your training. Like we plan for blocks of base, or we plan for blocks of a build phase, specific prep, tapers, things like that. Carb periodization basically follows a very similar strategy of we just look at where in our training cycle are we going to be doing high intensity work. And if you've listened to some of the other podcasts we've done on fuel utilization and fat versus carb and different strategies there, we talked a lot about if you want to do high intensity work, we need carbohydrates to be able to perform optimally. So it's looking at where in your training cycle, training year, training plan overall, are you going to be having those periods of high intensity work? So where are you racing? Where are you going to be doing your bulk of your really heavy, hard, high intensity sessions, whether that be your really hard threshold type sessions, or are you going to be focusing a lot on VO2 max type intervals? Whatever that may be, they're going to require high carbohydrate demand. So in those periods, we want to be fueling up pretty well from a carbohydrate perspective. But if we're looking at a different period of maybe lesser intensity as a focus, or a period like now, for example, is a good time where athletes aren't really racing, maybe you're doing some virtual racing, that might be a bit different. But if you're not racing at the moment, we are doing some high intensity, but we're doing it as a maintenance aspect. We're looking at just trying to maintain as much of our physiological adaptation and aerobic performance as we can, so that when we get back into a more normal period of training for races, etc., we can start to work from there. But it's the type of thing that if we aren't really doing a lot now, is there a real demand for high amount of carbohydrates? Potentially not. And for some people, maybe using a bit more of a low carb approach might be beneficial. So all we're doing here is just looking at the training cycle, the training plan, and going, well, what type of sessions am I doing? Am I doing racing? Am I going to need carbs for those to be able to perform optimally? Yes or no? And then we can decide, okay, what might be a better strategy for some of the other things we're going towards, and we can start to talk about body composition and maintaining body weight, or dropping a bit of body weight, or we can talk about maybe it's just a change in your diet, that we're not focused on I can only eat this, and this. It's, well, in these periods, I'm just going to focus on just eating really, I guess, cleanly, or I'm going to focus on, all right, I'm building a lot of carbs in because I'm doing some high intensity work. It's not locking you down to one aspect. You can start to pull some benefits from both sides of the spectrum. So it's just planning what you're eating, really, very simply.
Yeah. And look, I think personally, I'm a big fan of it if used in the correct manner. Like, it makes sense to fuel for the requirements that you have. So, if you have a high intensity session, as we said before, you need carbohydrates. Before I go into that, I guess I'll just give a quick overview of the fuels that we can use, and sort of the rough proportions that we have in our body. So we've obviously got creatine phosphate, which is a chemical fuel. You're going to run out of that in 10 seconds, so don't worry about that for endurance athletes. We've got carbohydrate, fat, and protein. All right. So carbohydrate, we've got about 2,000. Most people about 2,000 calories worth. So it's going to be about 2 hours worth of reasonably high intensity activity. So 2 hours worth of carbohydrates. Fat, we've got about a lean 70 kilo male still has 100,000 calories of stored fat in the body. So that's going to be enough for a couple of weeks, or 150 hours roughly on the rough maths of sub-max intensity. 150 hours worth. Plenty of fat, you could almost say an infinite number of fat stores. And protein, which we wouldn't really use under normal circumstances, but if we starve ourselves and completely run out of the rest, then we'll start to use that and break down our muscles and all the rest. But basically, we have 2 hours worth of carbs and about 150 hours worth of fat, right? So just thinking about that, well, we're never going to need to really, for the purpose of performance benefit, we're not going to have to increase our fat intake. We've already got plenty of it. Whereas we may need to increase our carbohydrate intake if we're going high intensity for a prolonged period above 2 hours, and it makes sense to increase your carbohydrate usage. So that's just some rough numbers. Now, As I said before, we know that as exercise intensity increases, so the higher the intensity, the more carbohydrate you'll use, the lower the intensity, the more fat you'll use. So if you're going out for an hour, 2 hour, even a 3 hour, really like slow, low intensity run, ride, whatever it is, then, you know, your baseline of about 2 hours worth of carbs is going to be plenty to get you through a low intensity session, because you're going to be using predominantly fat anyway. Even a 4 hour session, you'll probably be fine there. So it makes sense that if you are doing a 2, 3 or 4 hour zone 2 and keep making sure it stays in zone 2 for the whole duration, and where you're not going to be running out of your baseline carbohydrate levels, then yeah, you don't need to carbohydrate load for that training session, because you're going to have plenty in there. If you're talking about a race where you obviously increase the intensity, you'll start to burn more carbohydrates. You need more carbohydrates to begin with. If you're talking about a prolonged event where it's like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours, even if you're using predominantly fat, you're eventually going to run out of carbohydrates. So it would be beneficial to have some more carbohydrates in the lead up. As you said, now everyone's in maintenance mode. So yeah, you're right. People actually, to be fair, some people are training more because they have more time to do it. But a lot of people are doing, like myself, I'm doing a whole lot less than I would be doing, because there's no races on the horizon. So if you're doing significantly less training, then you're going to need significantly less carbohydrates. And then just purely from a body composition standpoint, if you eat carbohydrates and you don't use them, they're going to get stored as fat anyway, and that's going to increase your fat mass, and then that's going to play with your power to weight ratio, your general body composition, and that sort of stuff as well. And then there's nothing worse than, you know, all right, racing's back on in 4 months' time and I'm 6 kilos overweight, and it takes a long time to lose that, because that's the worst time to lose weight in a sense, because you don't want to starve yourself. You want to have plenty of energy. Like, yes, you generally will lose weight just purely because you can't physically eat enough compared to what you're expending, but racing seasons, when you want to maintain a stable weight, really, you don't want to be in a deficit. You want to have plenty of energy so you can perform to the best of your ability. So right now, if you're in a maintenance mode, it's probably the best time to cut weight and actually, reduce your carbohydrates, but increase your protein. Protein can't get turned to fat, right? Fat can obviously get turned to fat, and carbohydrate can get stored as fat as well. But protein, you just urinate out what you don't use. And I did a podcast on this the other day. Go back and listen to it, because you don't want to have too much protein or you stress your kidneys out and all the rest. So it's a bit of a balancing act. But I guess what I'm saying is, as a general rule, I'm a big fan of fueling for what you need. My opinion is that you're never going to need to fat load, because you've already got plenty, 150 hours plus worth of fat. But there are circumstances, races, prolonged effort, so on and so forth, where you will carbohydrate load, because you only have 2 hour baseline. If you can get that to a 2.5 hour base, that's going to be beneficial for performance. And then from a training perspective, yes, if you have if you're just doing a full week of just zone 2, then I wouldn't worry about upping your carbohydrate intake. I wouldn't go to low carb. You're still using it, but I'd just maintain a normal sort of diet. And we know with carbohydrate loading that the old style, do it for a week, is not really that necessary. You get the most benefit in the 48 hours leading up to it. So, you know, if you do have, let's say, I don't know, Monday to Friday, you're just doing 45-minute sessions to an hour, even if it's high intensity and you're still just eating a normal carbohydrate diet, that's plenty. You've still got that 2 hour baseline, right? That's plenty of carbs for that session, but then you're going to go do a 6 hour session on the weekend. Well, that's fine. Either increase your intake, or if you're doing, as I said in the podcast earlier, if you're currently doing 50% carbs, 25% fat, 25% proteins, and then drop some of the protein, drop some of the fat, and do 80% carbs, 10% fat, 10% protein, it's the same amount of calories. You're just changing or shifting the proportion of the food that you're eating, just based on the demands of the activity. So I'll throw it back over to you in a second, Nick, to add anything. But my summary of it is, absolutely do it. Yeah, do it for the sake of body composition and trying to maintain a lean body mass. I don't like doing it for the sake of, let's deplete our carbohydrate stores, because we might get some benefit from that. I think you want to have a baseline, and then you just want to increase your carbs when you need more high, like several high intensity sessions in a row or prolonged period, and you can decrease it when you're only training once or twice a week instead of 6 or 7 because you're in maintenance mode. Then decrease your carbs and increase your protein, because that's going to be good for your body composition.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the key. We don't necessarily want to be forcefully depleting carbohydrates. Like it's beneficial potentially in some circumstances to be using more fat as a fuel, and there is certain ways that we can do that. But if it's at the detriment of, you know, like being able to then use carbs, we're going to be diminishing the performance or limiting performance anyway. Is what we see in the research, and the other way you want to go as well is you want to be careful about when you time this, because if you do decide, like you said, if you do decide to go a bit of that sort of low carb approach, and maybe it is for a weight management perspective in a certain period, but then we start coming back into racing, you want to start getting that ball rolling from a usage of carbs reasonably early on, because if you're leaving it to last minute, and I've got some notes from some research in front of me of doing a periodized strategy of chronic low carb, high fat, so being that low carb athlete for majority of the time, and then doing a very short carbohydrate loaded program of only sort of 24 hours. Maybe if you tried 48, it might give a slightly different result, but 24 hours of carb loading after pretty much minimal carbs in the entire lead up to that event significantly impairs performance. It provides a really big sort of limiting aspect of performance. And we're talking here, the specific study I'm referring to is 10K race walkers. I like the fact that some of these studies that come out of the AIS on nutrition are to do with race walkers in particular, because when we compare race walking versus, say, running, obviously runners are going to be working at a higher pace or higher intensity. They're able to hold a higher intensity because the walkers are limited by a technique aspect potentially that limits the percentage of VO2 max they can hold over their race, etc. If we're getting impairment to race walking performance, then we're likely getting a significantly more impaired performance for a runner. So really overall, it's the type of thing that you just want to be careful when the timing of it. There is benefits here and there, but we then have to consider when you are coming back into a racing period, don't just then dump all the carbs in it last minute. That's probably going to be worse than if you just slowly progress them back in, or if you just didn't even bother about it at all. So just got to be mindful of the timing. It's probably a key one to add.
Yeah, and I think with that, and again, this comes to a podcast, it'll be probably last week if you're listening to it now, about is carbohydrate loading still the recommended practice. And you got to remember that if you have 1 gram of carbohydrate, you're going to get 4 grams of water, I think is right. So you smash in 200 grams of carbs in a day, and you're going to retain 800 grams of water weight. You're going to feel bloated and sick and all the rest. So yeah, I definitely agree that if you're going to take a lower carb approach, then you want to sort of gradually build that back up so you don't feel rubbish and sluggish and heavy. And also on that, if you're going to reduce your carbohydrate intake, which, it's fair enough if you're reducing your workload quite a lot at the moment. The key is after a depleting session, whether that be an hour of intervals or whether that be a 4-hour long ride, that timing, that 15-minute super compensation window post exercise, where your body is searching and actively searching for carbohydrate, that's when you want to get those carbs in. Because even if you only get, let's say you get if you get the recommended sort of 1 gram, 1 to 1.5 grams in. So let's say, you're 50 kilos, let's say you're 70 kilos, you get 70 grams of carbs in, just what's that, 2 gels or whatever it is, within that 15-minute window after exercise, you're going to use all of it. Your muscles are going to store all of it, as opposed to if you then delayed it by 3 hours, where we know that it takes twice as long, if not more, 2 to 3 times longer to get back to normal resting glycogen levels. So if you are going to reduce your carbohydrate intake, that's fine, but don't do it at the detriment of recovery post-session. Make sure you still get that in straight after the session. So is there anything else you want to add to this conversation, or should we wrap up?
Probably just like making sure when you are getting carbs in, you're getting them from the right sources, and not just using it as an excuse to eat bad stuff. It is probably the other big sort of takeout. It's just like some of the, I guess, anecdotal evidence that we see with improved performance by not using carbs has typically been as a result of either body weight reduction that's helped economy, or it's been as a result of just cutting out stuff of the diet that just didn't need to be there in the first place. So just making sure that when you are getting sources of fuel in, we're getting clean, high quality source of fuel. And what I mean by that is just eating as natural as possible, ideally, is probably the way to go. So something to be mindful of. It's like, just because you're going into a period of high carb doesn't mean you can just go smash as many donuts and ice cream and stuff as you like. You still got to be smart about what you are actually putting into your body to get the most out of that fuel, rather than just going full in. Some of the other end of the spectrum, if you're going a bit lower carb, you're going a bit more, increasing how much fat you're getting in or protein, etc. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily sit down and all you're having for dinner is a giant steak and that's it. It's, well, what type of sources am I getting that protein from? Because it's going to give a very different result based on how you get that in. So that's probably something to still be mindful of. I don't think we'll touch on it too much because it's more, I guess, a dietitian, nutritionist base, but think about what you're putting in when you're going for either approach, because it's not necessarily as simple as, oh, well, that's got carbs in it, so I can eat that. You still got to be mindful of, well, is that a high GI carb or is it a low GI carb, and the complexities that work under it. But from a broader perspective, yeah, carbs are still king for endurance performance.
Yeah, and I guess, again, we won't go into too much detail, but yeah, you're right in the sense where, the old style, and it's still somewhat recommended practice, but it is shifting towards a shorter carbohydrate load. But it used to be you just need to get 7 to 10 grams of carbohydrate in. If that's Gatorade or if it's Coke, whether it's a donut, it didn't really matter, just get the carbohydrates in. And obviously, if you're doing that, if you're a footy player doing that week in, week out, or whatever it is, if you're racing regularly, you can think of the calories, the caloric intake that you're getting is it eventually could be detrimental to your body composition and obviously how you feel. And getting hunger flats because high GI, you get a big insulin spike and then you crash, and it's just really, it's not good from a consistent energy level perspective. So definitely that. And then the time and the place, for me, I kind of say, look, obviously you want the high quality, lower GI carbohydrates because you feel fuller for longer. That's going to be good for your body composition and all the rest. And then I normally give guys a pretty much free rein for that 15-minute post-exercise window. That's when you want to have your can of Coke. You see the Tour de France riders do it. They get to the top of the mountain, can of Coke, caffeine tick, and sugar tick. That 15-minute window, you kind of have free rein to just get sugar in. And then obviously, either side of that is when during activity, you want high GI, like your sugary stuff, because your body doesn't have the blood supply to break down the lower GI stuff, and immediately after exercise. But then, your breakfast and your lead up and your post meals and all that sort of stuff would be more that higher quality, lower GI carbohydrates. I absolutely agree with. Awesome. I think we'll wrap it up there. So in summary, we are big fans of fueling for the demand required. Again, you should never really need to fat load because you've got 150 hours plus worth of it. But there are instances where you would do a shorter carbohydrate load. We are definitely getting towards that 1 to 2 day carbohydrate load as opposed to the old style traditional 7 days or 7 to 10. Right now, people who are in maintenance mode doing 50% of the training load, it's probably a good time to maybe take control of that potential body composition, lose a little bit of fat mass potentially. If you maintain the same diet as you always have been, but you're doing half the exercise, you're going to inevitably put on fat mass, which is going to be hard to lose or detrimental if you lose it during race season because you don't want to be in that calorie deficit. If you have back-to-back high-intensity sessions, you would think about just not necessarily increasing carbohydrate intake, but dropping your fat and protein and replacing it with a carbohydrate alternative so you get more carbs. Likewise, if you're doing a really long session, 4+ hours, even if it's zone 2, 4+ hours, you'll probably lose that 2 hour of base carbohydrates. So it would be beneficial to increase the intake a little bit there. But the key there, as we said before, is straight after, within 15 minutes, smash 1 to sort of 1.5 grams of carb in. That can be sugary stuff, doesn't matter in this circumstance, but then everything else should be pretty high quality foods, just like a healthy diet should be. So thank you for listening. Any questions, please let us know. Otherwise, I'll speak to you on the next podcast.